Location: Palermo, Sicily. Date: July 10, 1943. Time: 03 AM. The air above the Tyrrhenian Sea was thick with the scent of salt and fear. Not the immediate, visceral fear of a close-range firefight, but the slow, corrosive dread that precedes overwhelming force. On the beaches of Sicily, men of the German Hermann Göring Division and the Italian coastal defenses braced for the storm that had been brewing for months. They were confident, or at least they had been trained to be. They believed in the quality of their machines, the purity of their design, the refined philosophy of the Axis war effort. They believed, above all, in the fundamental incompetence of the Americanos. This belief, this fatal illusion, was the central tragedy of the Axis High Command. In the early days of the conflict, from the triumphs in North Africa to the relentless blitz over Britain, the Axis powers operated under a singular, comforting delusion that the Western democracies, bloated by luxury and paralyzed by internal politics, were incapable of fighting a sustained modern mechanized war. The Americans, in particular, were dismissed as soft bankers and mechanics, their equipment clunky, over-engineered, and aesthetically clumsy. Consider the perspectives of 1940. Colonel Giuseppe Rossi, a liaison officer from the Regia Aeronautica, visited a German factory producing the formidable Messerschmitt Bf 109. He saw precision, dedication, and quality. Every rivet, every weld, spoke of engineering supremacy. Later, he would read reports on American industrial output, numbers that seemed fantastical, pulled from a dime store comic book. Rossi and his colleagues would scoff. "It is propaganda," they would agree, raising a glass of Chianti. "They speak of thousands of aircraft. Where is the quality? Where is the pilot to fly them? A nation of shopkeepers cannot suddenly forge an army of titans." This was the ironical trap. The Axis measured war in terms of individual quality and genius, while the Allies were about to measure it in tons, square footage, and sheer unrelenting statistical volume. The first hint of this imbalance often came from captured material. German tank crews in Tunisia, after dispatching a Sherman tank with relative ease, would express professional contempt for its boxy, tall profile. They praised the Tiger and the Panther for their sleek armor and potent 80mm guns. But as the fighting wore on, the numbers began to tell a different, sinister story. For every Tiger that rolled off the assembly line, the Americans were fielding 5, 10, sometimes 20 Shermans. It was not a matter of quality, it was a matter of basic, overwhelming arithmetic. The true moment of awakening, the sudden, sharp primo colpo of dread, often came not from the battlefield, but from the testimony of those few Axis personnel who, through a twist of fate, perhaps a prisoner exchange or an espionage report, had a glimpse behind the curtain of the American industrial machine. The accounts were often dismissed as shell-shocked exaggeration. The reality, obscured by oceans and propaganda, was that the United States was, quite literally, transforming itself into the arsenal of democracy. President Roosevelt's promise was not a mere political slogan, it was a factory floor manifest. The industrial scale was not just larger, it was organized on a completely different philosophical basis, something alien and terrifying to the European mindset, which still held vestiges of artisanal production and small-batch excellence. As the landing craft approached the Sicilian beaches, casting long dark shadows in the pre-dawn light, the Italian defenders were counting the meager anti-tank guns at their disposal. They were focused on the quality of their defense. They did not yet comprehend the sheer indifferent quantity of the enemy that was about to land, a quantity that would, in the end, make their courage, their training, and their superior engineering utterly irrelevant. The illusion of Axis superiority was about to shatter against the immovable wall of American steel, built on assembly lines the likes of which Europe had never conceived. This massive, silent engine of war was the true secret weapon of the Allies. If you're finding this deep dive into the hidden machinery of World War II compelling, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We'll be uncovering more overlooked chapters in military history every week. Location: Willow Run, Michigan, USA. Date: June 1942. Perspective: a highly classified German spy report. The documents were initially filed under psychological warfare. a classification for enemy propaganda considered too outlandish to be true. The source was a disgruntled Italian engineer who, prior to the US entry into the war, had briefly worked near the emerging industrial complex of Henry Ford. His report detailed the construction of an enormous factory, a building so vast it was said to contain its own internal climate. The factory's purpose: the mass production of the consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber. The figures provided were staggering and, to the German High Command, patently absurd. Ford's goal was not to produce one aircraft per day, or even two. The goal was one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. This level of output defied the industrial logic of the Reich. In Germany, an aircraft was assembled by skilled artisans, its construction a painstaking process requiring specialized tools and highly trained labor. The Me-262 jet fighter, for example, required thousands of hours of skilled, non-repeatable labor. To produce a bomber, a complex machine requiring thousands of parts at a rate of 1 per hour, suggested either an appalling lack of quality or a method of production that bordered on the occult. The crucial difference lay in Ford's application of the moving assembly line to a product as complex as an aircraft. This concept, commonplace in automotive manufacturing, was revolutionary and terrifying in the context of aviation. The Willow Run facility was nearly 3.5 million square feet, with an assembly line stretching over a mile. It was less a factory and more an enclosed, man-made river of steel, constantly flowing towards completion. The Axis leadership was trapped by their own standards of excellence. General Hans Kreiper, a logistics expert in the Wehrmacht who reviewed the spy reports, dismissed the B-24 figures. "A bomber built in an hour," he wrote in a memo, "is a bomber that will not fly. It is a suicide coffin. We must not be distracted by American bluster. Our engineers prioritize quality and maintainability. Theirs prioritizes speed and waste." This analysis overlooked the terrifying statistical reality. Even if the American planes had a slightly higher failure rate, the sheer quantity meant they would always dominate the skies. It was the difference between a precision scalpel and an endless, overwhelming tide. However, the most definitive and shocking proof came during the Sicilian campaign, Operation Husky, and later the landings in Italy. Captured Italian officers, including Major General Enrico Santini, were taken to North African staging areas before being shipped to permanent POW camps in the United States. It was during their brief, supervised transit through the American mainland, perhaps a deliberate act of psychological warfare, perhaps mere logistical necessity, that their worldviews collapsed. General Santini later described the scene in his memoirs, recounting a stop near an undisclosed airfield in the American South. "We were driven down a highway, and what I saw defied belief. Not a single airfield, but a string of airfields stretching past the horizon. And on each one, parked wing to wing, were thousands of aircraft. They were not new. They were used, dusty, ready to be scrapped, yet they were stacked like cordwood. We were told these were the reserve aircraft, already replaced by newer models. The numbers were like grain spilled across the land. It was not a shortage. It was an absolute indifference to loss. The sight was overwhelming. Thousands of P-40 Warhawks, P-51 Mustangs, and B-25 Mitchells sitting idly in the sun, waiting for a destination. Santini confessed the true, cold realization that struck him. We had been fighting a war of accountants, counting every machine we lost, every drop of fuel. The Americans were fighting a war of limitless resources. They did not count. They simply replaced. The difference was not military, it was metaphysical. The scale created an emotional, psychological terror. It wasn't just the planes, it was the infrastructure. The miles of rail cars carrying tanks, the colossal port facilities, the endless lines of trucks. For the European officers, accustomed to the elegant but ultimately finite resources of their smaller nations, this industrial output was not impressive, it was obscene. It was a brutal mechanical manifestation of a power they could not hope to match. The Axis High Command had failed to understand that the American industrial system was, in itself, a weapon more potent than any single tank or fighter plane. It was a production machine that, once fully mobilized, could not be stopped, only buried under its own output. And this was the secret the Axis generals were only beginning to grasp, a secret that spelled their inevitable doom. Location: Inglewood, California, USA. Date: early 1943. Subject: the North American P-51 Mustang. The North American P-51 Mustang was initially a disappointment, a classic example of wartime irony. A fighter born of British desperation, initially powered by a distinctly uninspired American Allison engine. Pilots liked its range, but its performance above 15,000 feet was sluggish. The Germans, flying their superbly balanced Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109, dismissed it. "A good scout, perhaps," a captured Luftwaffe pilot remarked, "but no match for the Jagdflieger in a real fight." The Axis belief in their own aeronautical superiority was deeply entrenched. They saw the Mustang as one more piece of the mass-produced American puzzle, serviceable, but lacking the soul and speed of German engineering. They failed to appreciate the single elegant modification that would turn the P-51 from a decent fighter into the most feared escort in the European theatre: the British Packard 5-1650 Merlin engine. This engine, a license-built version of the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin, was more than just a power plant. It was the key to unlocking the Mustang's true potential. When mated to the P-51's revolutionary laminar flow wing design, the aircraft's high-altitude performance was utterly transformed. It suddenly possessed the speed, altitude, and, crucially, the range to escort B-17 Flying Fortress bombers all the way to their targets deep inside Germany and back again. Prior to the Mustang's widespread deployment, Allied bombing missions into the heart of the Reich were suicidal. The bombers had to fly beyond the range of their escort fighters, leaving them vulnerable to massed attacks by the Luftwaffe's interceptors. The German pilots knew exactly where the Allied fighters would turn back: the Mustang line. Beyond that line, the skies were theirs for the picking, and the B-17s were helpless, flying targets. The German strategy was simple and effective: wait for the unprotected bombers, then destroy them. The introduction of the long-range P-51 changed the very nature of air warfare, introducing a new level of psychological terror for the German pilots. Lieutenant Klaus Richter, a seasoned Bf-109 pilot, recalled the shift in his squadron. Before 1944, a bomber stream was a harvesting opportunity. We knew the distance. We knew they were alone. Then, the first reports came. Fighters, high, deep inside the Reich. We dismissed it. Fuel tanks must be auxiliary, discarded quickly. But they stayed. They stayed all the way to the target, and they engaged with ferocity. The most devastating psychological blow came not from the loss of the bombers, but from the sudden, unannounced appearance of the Mustangs. Richter's unit, waiting to engage the B-17s over Frankfurt, found themselves ambushed by the high-flying P-51s, which could dive on the interceptors with devastating speed. The German pilots, trained to seek out and destroy the slower bombers, were now the prey. The P-51 was a technological statement. It was fast, maneuverable, and, thanks to the American production lines, numerous. The production numbers were the silent payload of the Mustang. North American aviation was churning them out at a rate that dwarfed the combined output of the Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories. It was a war of attrition where the Luftwaffe simply couldn't afford to trade losses. A German pilot once trained was irreplaceable. A P-51 once lost was replaced by another within days. The P-51's secret wasn't just its engine, it was the industrial infrastructure that birthed it, a system that treated the loss of an aircraft as a minor statistical fluctuation. This new reality fundamentally broke the German defense strategy. The Luftwaffe was forced to commit its dwindling resources and priceless veteran pilots in direct, non-advantageous combat deep within German airspace. This air campaign, known as Big Week, was the climax of the aerial war, a systematic dismantling of the German fighter force. The Mustang, the very aircraft the Axis had initially derided, was the perfect weapon to execute this industrial, numerical strategy of annihilation. The skies over Germany, once a fortress, were now a hunting ground, and the hunter wore the distinctive low-drag wings of the P-51 Mustang. Location: a secret Luftwaffe intelligence briefing, Berlin. Date: October 1944. The mood in the underground bunker was not one of defiance, but of grim statistical resignation. The strategic genius of the Blitzkrieg had given way to the cold, crushing reality of industrial warfare. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was no longer fighting for victory, it was fighting for survival, and the numbers were screaming that survival was impossible. The intelligence briefing focused on two stark sets of data: production capacity versus training pipeline. These numbers were only half the horror. The German factories were, despite relentless Allied bombing, still capable of producing excellent machines. The problem was, who would fly them? The American and British pilot training programs, the cadet schools, were a hidden masterpiece of mass production. The US alone trained over 193,000 pilots during the war. These pilots, while often less experienced than the Luftwaffe's veterans, were fed into the system constantly. The loss of an American pilot, while a tragedy, did not cripple the fighting force. A replacement was already in the pipeline, trained on simulators and then on standardized, reliable aircraft like the T-6 Texan. In sharp contrast, the Luftwaffe's training pipeline was broken. Fuel shortages meant pilots trained on fewer hours, often being sent into combat with less than 200 hours of flight time, compared to the 400-plus hours logged by a typical American combat pilot. The elite German Experten, the aces with 100 or more kills, were irreplaceable. Their deaths represented not just the loss of a plane, but the irreplaceable loss of decades of combat wisdom. General Erich Schneider, an analyst presenting the report, summed up the true nature of the strategic failure. "We won the battles of quality. They won the war of quantity. When our best pilot with 300 kills is shot down by an American with 15 hours of solo flight, it is not a testament to the enemy's skill. It is a testament to their logistics. They can afford to lose the 15-hour pilot. We cannot afford to lose the 300-kill ace." This psychological drain was devastating. German pilots began to refer to the American fighter formations not as Staffeln, squadrons, but as a swarm or a factory in the air. They felt the crushing weight of a war machine that did not tire, did not run out of fuel, and did not run out of men. The industrial logistics were a constant source of disbelief. The American ability to ship vast quantities of war material across the globe, across the entire Atlantic, an ocean plagued by U-boats, was a logistical marvel. When the American invasion forces hit the beaches of Normandy, they brought with them fully assembled locomotives, miles of pipeline, Operation Pluto, and entire temporary harbors, Mulberry. This material abundance created a feeling of overwhelming helplessness among the German infantry. Corporal Horst Neumann, a young panzer grenadier captured in France, recounted the shock. "We would fight for a village for a week. We would hold until our last round. The next morning, the Americans would appear with entirely new formations, tanks that seemed to have materialized from the dust, and they would sweep forward again. For us, every new tank was a miracle. For them, it was a replacement, delivered on time. The material difference was demoralizing. We were fighting men who had no concept of shortage. The statistics of fear culminated in a simple, horrifying truth. The Axis had based its entire strategy on a quick, decisive victory, one that would preempt the mobilization of the West. They had failed. The United States, the arsenal of democracy, was now fully mobilized. The sheer indifferent power of American industry was the strategic center of gravity, and it was crushing the Axis war effort, one irreplaceable German life and one easily replaceable American machine at a time. Hiroshima, Japan, Detroit, Michigan. Date: August 1945, post-war 1947. The war in Europe had ended in a spectacular, inevitable collapse under the weight of Allied material supremacy. The war in the Pacific would end with a terrifying technological crescendo, but even the atomic bomb was, at its core, a product of that same unrelenting industrial complex, the vast, sprawling Manhattan Project. The legacy of the American industrial machine transcends the battlefield. It fundamentally redefined the nature of geopolitical power. The Axis powers, particularly Germany, had believed their technological edge, the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet, the Tiger tank, would grant them the upper hand. They were convinced that quality would trump quantity. But the Allied strategy proved that in modern total war, the ability to produce a good enough machine in overwhelming numbers is superior to the ability to produce a perfect machine in scarce numbers. This lesson was hard learned by the surviving Axis personnel. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, provided the definitive post-war analysis. He repeatedly noted that German production never truly peaked until 1944, far too late. He also lamented the strategic decision to prioritize small-scale, advanced weaponry over mass production standardization, a choice rooted in German technological arrogance. "Our greatest mistake was underestimating the American capacity for mass production," Speer concluded. "We were so focused on the elegance of our designs that we missed the power of their assembly line." The ultimate paradox of the war was that the industrial powerhouse of the United States did not simply produce weapons for the Allies, it created the very conditions for Allied victory. The Lend-Lease Act poured billions of dollars in equipment, food, and raw materials into Britain and the Soviet Union, keeping those nations in the fight until America's own military machine was fully operational. The T-34 tanks on the Eastern Front, the trucks carrying British supplies, the very steel in the British factories, much of it was either American-made or supported by American logistics. The war's true climax wasn't a single battle, it was the final, irreversible moment when the Axis realized they were drowning in a sea of Allied production. The sound of the American industrial machine, the deep, constant hum of the Willow Run factory, was the death knell of the Third Reich. The final irony came in the post-war world. The same factories that had churned out B-24s, Mustangs, and Sherman tanks did not stand idle. They pivoted almost overnight back to consumer production. The skills, the infrastructure, and the mindset that built the arsenal of democracy now built the world's most powerful economy. The assembly lines that produced 100,000 aircraft were quickly adapted to produce millions of cars, refrigerators, and washing machines. The officers who in 1942 scoffed at the American nation of shopkeepers eventually saw those shopkeepers win the largest mechanized conflict in human history. Their victory was not achieved by a single heroic invention, but by the relentless industrial application of basic arithmetic: more production, more training, more logistics. The true story of the war is not just the bravery of the soldiers, but the terrifying efficiency of the factories that stood behind them. The American assembly line remains the most potent and perhaps the most terrifying weapon of the Second World War. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the industrial realities of World War II. If you want more stories that reveal the hidden strategic and technological layers of history, please like this video, share it with a fellow history enthusiast, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps us keep the history alive.